All right, we've got yet another awesome interview for you guys. It's Dr. Avi Tuschman. He's written the book, Our Political Nature, the Evolutionary Origins of What Divides Us. Wait till you see what this leads to, okay? Really fascinating stuff that I've been curious about for a long, long time. Can't wait to talk to you about it. Avi, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you, Jake.
All right, now you got to understand a couple things about Avi. First of all, he's got a PhD in evolutionary anthropology from Stanford University. Not a big deal, please. And he was former speechwriter for Peruvian President Alejandro Toledo. And he did that, well, I mean, it took him a while. He did that at the age of 23. Okay, so fascinating guy. Before we even get into the book, let me ask you about that. How in the world did you become a speechwriter for the president of Peru at 23?
Well, actually, that was a little bit later. But at 23, when I began this career in politics, I started off advising the First Lady of Peru on indigenous peoples issues.
Oh, okay.
And that happened because I was an anthropologist and I'd done my research on Quechua-speaking groups.
Of course, yeah, me too. Mm-hmm. No. Okay, so that's what leads you to Peru, I see. And then you did a good job there and then went on to get promoted too.
Exactly.
So, interesting. Okay, so let's talk about evolutionary anthropology as it relates to politics, okay? So a lot of people think that we make rational decisions based on our political ideology and that our ideology is based on those rational decisions. Are you here to tell me that's not the case?
Well, it is and it isn't. It's very easy to test because if you look at people's income brackets, and if people were rational agents in the way that economics is traditionally assumed that they are, people in lower brackets would vote for more redistributive policies and richer people would vote against that. But in fact, when you look at everything, there's often no significant correlation at all, which means that people are voting against their personal interests just as often as not. There are just too many wealthy liberals in places like LA and New York, and too many poor conservatives in places like Oklahoma.
So what do you think drives it?
The greatest cause of left-right voting across time and space are three clusters of measurable personality traits.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so what are they and which side do they lean on?
So as I demonstrated in Our Political Nature, these three clusters revolve around opposing attitudes toward tribalism, inequality, and also differing perceptions of human nature. That is, whether we see people as more competitive or as more cooperative.
See, that's why I'm a moderate, because I see humans as clearly competitive and cooperative. Okay, and I fail to understand how other people can't see that. That seems to be the most obvious thing in the world to me. But anyway, so break it down for me. Who falls in what category?
So people on the right half of the spectrum, and I should emphasize here that it is a spectrum and it forms a bell curve. So most people are in the middle. They're just a bit underrepresented in political elites and the media, who tend to have a bit more polarized views and a bit more coherent and enduring views as well. But if we look at political spectrums around the world, we find that more self-interested views of human nature correlate with people on the right of the spectrum. There are also people who see human nature as getting worse. And there are people on the other end of the spectrum, on the left, who see human nature as getting better, even as being able to get perfected.
So yeah, I'm obviously biased here because now I'm considered on the left, right? I mean, I view myself as a moderate, but in the American spectrum, they say, "Oh, come on, you're left." So don't we win? We're the better guys. We think that things can get better, and they're more closed-minded.
Well, there has been a lot of what I'd call partisan triumphalism in the discussion of this book. There have been people who've taken really cherry-picked excerpts to use as partisan spears. Say, look, I told you that we were better, we're more generous or whatever, and those other guys are fearful or they're more ethnocentric, and those things are obviously bad.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah, I don't, but I don't look at it that way. In fact, a lot of people have made assumptions about my own views, and most of them have been completely wrong. As I show in the book, and I probably should have emphasized this more because it doesn't come till about the end, but nature has carved out these distributions of our personalities over thousands of generations for a reason. And there are these fundamental conflicts in nature, conflicts of our ancestors have had to calculate self-interest against altruism over and over again. And there isn't an obvious answer to some of these social conflicts. If there was, everybody would be the same. And the same thing applies to issues of tribalism, whether you trust your own group more or cooperate with other groups.
So are you saying that nature kind of set it so that we would be a little bit split? So that, because sometimes you need to be altruistic, sometimes you need to be selfish, and if you have a certain amount of people willing to be either one of those things, that you'll, in mass, have some sort of balance in society that you need?
I believe that's true, but I don't look in the book at these things as occurring for the benefit of the group or the benefit of society. I look at it more at the individual level of selection. There's actually a debate right now about, in these kind of books, whether we are the way we are, whether we've evolved for the benefit of a group or society, that's called group selection, or whether we are the way we are because our actions have had an impact at the individual level or at the level of genes.
I have an answer for that too. I didn't study any of this. I don't need a PhD for this. Okay, please. It's both, right? There's a spectrum in everything, and we're somewhere in that spectrum where bees are obviously do things for the good of the group, right? And I assume there's some form of animals that are on that extreme end of that. And I don't know where we are in that spectrum, but we're somewhere in that spectrum.
Well, when it comes to group selection, and as you mentioned, the big argument has been looking at human beings as analogous to eusocial insects like bees. This has come up in Edward Wilson's last book and in the Jonathan Haidt book. I'm agnostic. I think it's very interesting. If there were some good evidence, I'd be open-minded to looking at it. But I haven't seen that. And I have seen a tremendous amount of evidence for individual level selection and kin selection. So even though this is a fun book and it's for a general audience, and I try to keep it fresh and connected to the news stories that are affecting our lives every day, and also to high-level personalities, it's also a very serious and rigorous science book. So I don't just imagine stories about the way our ancestors may have been. I actually have hard data where I'm calculating evolutionary fitness. In other words, what was it about the ways that our ancestors, and even today, because these processes are going on right now in demographic trends that are changing the face of our country and our world, what is it about the way that we're surviving and also reproducing in differential or unequal ways that is going to have an impact on future populations?
So we're going to get to that fun stuff, because when you say reproducing, of course, you're talking about sex. Sex is fun.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to get into that in a second. But first, let me continue to stay with politics for a second. So what is it about our prehistoric nature that leads a guy to be on the, Glenn Beck to be on the right and Hugo Chavez to be on the left? So, and is there anything that can be done about it? Or was Hugo Chavez destined to be a leftist? Facts or circumstances be damned, and Glenn Beck to be on the right?
I don't have an answer for the question about destiny. It's almost a philosophical problem, whether things are predetermined. But at least from the knowledge we have now, if they are predetermined, that would include the biological part and the environmental part. But basically, we can't say that everything is determined from the genes. We know that's not true. Only about half of the variance in our political attitudes come from these genetic differences between individuals. Whether or not he was destined to grow up in the way he did and have all the environmental influences, I can't say. It might be possible, but I don't like it when you see the words hardwired or predestined. It's a bit more tricky than that. Our brains are very flexible.
So let me ask it in a different way. I understand what you're saying. Of course, I agree with that. So if someone else were to grow up with the same genes and in the same situation that Hugo Chavez grew up in, are they almost certainly going to be a leftist? Or could they have made different choices? Do you see what I'm saying? I don't mean identical. If it's identical, it's Hugo Chavez. Mm-hmm. But to what degree do we have choice?
Well, if they had the exact same genes and the exact same experience, I'd say it's highly likely.
Right.
Of course, if they had very different experiences, they could have come out different. But again, it's really a philosophical thing. It's very hard to do an experiment like that. The closest we can do is look at experiments of twins who are separated at birth. And we can look at the fraternal twins and the monozygotic, the identical twins, and calculate about what proportion of this variance is coming from their genes. And the kind of take-home point here is that it's a higher, the heritability of these attitudes is quite a bit higher than most of us assumed.
Right. So now, look, I just keep getting stuck on the prehistoric thing. All right, so but we all lived through that, and yet half of us are on the right side of the spectrum and half of us on the left side of the spectrum. So what conclusion can you draw from that?
Well, again, most people are in the middle, and if you can imagine like a bell-shaped curve, it looks very much like height or weight or blood pressure. Not at all like income distribution, though, incidentally, which is highly skewed toward the lower income brackets. It doesn't look like one of those nice normal curves. So to answer your question, the way that I look at this in the book is that there are these series of conflicts in nature. And these come back to these 3 measurable personality traits, where you take one like openness, for example. That's one of the major dimensions used to measure human personality. And it also correlates quite well with left-right voting, even though there are better dimensions in the book. But obviously, it wouldn't have been good for people to be completely open or completely closed. So there's a balance. And it's the same thing with these politically relevant personality traits, like your belief in a just world, for example. That relates to tolerance of inequality, which is one of these 3 clusters. So some people are more biased to looking at the world as being fundamentally just, that people basically get what they deserve and deserve what they get. So I don't have a lot of advice or prescriptions in the book, but one of the very few I do mention at the end is if you do find yourself assuming that the world is basically fair, it's healthy to try to see it the other way from time to time, and vice versa. If you think everything is kind of rigged and the system's always, everyone's sort of a victim, it's good to practice looking at the world in the other way.
Yeah, I hear you, but nonetheless, and again, this might go obviously towards my bias, but let's talk it out, right? So on those 2 issues, openness. So I understand what you're saying. If you're open to everything, you're going to eat the poison mushroom and you're going to die, right?
Right.
So there's an extreme you shouldn't go to. If you're close to everything, you're not going to try enough things to be able to survive and pick up so much knowledge that you would need, et cetera, right? But on the scale of openness, isn't it rational to lean 70% in the direction, at least, of openness, as opposed, like, I don't think you should play it right down the middle. Do you see what I'm saying by that?
I see what you're saying, but you see the evidence in people's personalities. Maybe it's that the environments of the past where people lived were quite a bit more dangerous. And if we look at some of the ethnographies of hunter-gatherer groups, the chance of being killed, especially if you're a male, in warfare, or even just a dispute by another male, were actually very high, much higher than today. So perhaps our environment today is a bit safer, and maybe thousands of years down the line, if it continues to stay safer, maybe we'd see a different distribution. If you're correct, if there are advantages that translate into survival and reproduction benefits, then that's what you have to prove, and that's where I get very particular in this book, is I really try to measure how are these different personality traits connected, not just hypothetically, but in how can we measure differences in reproduction?
But see, that's why I knew this interview was going to be really interesting, right? Because you might be right in the prehistoric days, right? So if you were more closed-minded to a lot of things, you might have avoided a lot of the dangers that existed out there. You might not have gotten eaten by the lion. You might have avoided the warfare, et cetera. And listen, I don't know what's out there. And what's out there could be really, really bad. I'm going to stay right here where I know it's safe, right? Mm-hmm. That could have been a real advantage for you. But in today's world, that's not really the case at all. Being closed-minded seems like a monumental disadvantage. Now, I don't know that it's to the point where it would be an evolutionary disadvantage, which is a totally different thing, right? In which case, if it was, then the arc of history would bend towards open-mindedness, right? Mm-hmm. That's what you were alluding to before. But in the real world, forget the evolutionary advantage. being closed-minded is kind of a knucklehead move. Do you see what I'm saying? We don't live with the lions and the tigers anymore. It's to a much greater advantage to be open-minded. Mm-hmm. Don't you think?
Well, it really depends on, it's kind of a value issue, but I want to tie it back again to the evolutionary part, specifically reproduction. So, for example, as I show in great detail in the book, these personality traits don't exist for their own sake. To create a personality profile to make someone more interesting or creative. That's not really what nature is looking at, if it's looking at all.
Mm-hmm.
But what evolution is selecting for is who's surviving and reproducing more. So basically, these personality traits are mechanisms that kind of load the dice, right? People who are more open also tend to disperse more. And we see this even in non-human animals. In the book, I show how in a population of birds called great tits, which are one of the most...
Did you just say great tits?
Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome.
It's actually,
okay.
I believe it's called Parus major, if I'm getting the scientific term correct.
No, I prefer great tits.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, let's go with that then.
Okay, all right, God bless.
So this is one of the most studied populations of birds in the world. And we find the same thing in mammals, but there's actually individual differences in personalities that are causing certain birds and certain human beings to go further away from home. And that's loading the dice in who they're going to reproduce with, how close or distant the genetic relationship is between them.
Mm-hmm.
And when you calculate their fertility over the lifetime, you find great differences. So that's the way that nature is working, is changing the proportion of the frequencies of different genes linked to different personalities and carving these out. And there's actually an optimal level of reproduction. I don't mean optimal in any kind of moral way, just simply if you're going to have a race to see who could reproduce the most quickly over time, there is probably an answer. That you wouldn't want to marry your first cousin, obviously not anyone closer. But
unless she was really hot, of course.
Yeah, maybe you'd make an exception. But well, Darwin married his first cousin, I think it was.
But that guy's a heathen.
Well, the problem is when you do this over and over and over again as a cultural pattern, it can create some issues. And you wouldn't marry your ninth cousin. You'd marry someone in between, probably your fourth cousin.
Yeah. That's why I kept looking at my fourth cousin. I was like, I'm good at this evolution thing. All right, so, and I like what you're saying about the birds, and there's the Jonathan Seagulls of birds that fly higher and higher, mm-hmm. and further away from the flock. And here in the U.S., you see that it's amazing how well you see it, because the heartland, the middle of the country, is far more conservative, because those are the people who stayed home, mm-hmm. right? And the coasts are far more liberal, because those are the people who migrated to the coasts. Mm-hmm. And so that's the liberal personality, is to be open and to go out. And so that's absolutely fascinating. But in the case of the birds, not us, because I think it would take an enormously long period of time. And there isn't just, I'm of the opinion there isn't much evolution going on right now, because we all survive. I mean, there's so much of us survive because of modern science, medicine, et cetera. You're going to tell me that's a little wrong. Mm-hmm. Okay, but let me ask a question first. In the birds, if a certain percentage that are genetically oriented to fly away from the flock, and there's a certain percentage genetically oriented to stay with the flock, at some point, do they risk being two different species?
Well, that can happen over a lot of time, especially if there's a reproductive barrier for whatever reason. But in the case of the birds, the ones who are flying fewer than, I think it was about 200 meters away, they're about 3.5 times more likely to mate with a sibling or a parent, and then that would create something like 55% fewer viable offspring.
Yeah, that's kind of gross.
It's kind of gross, and it doesn't really help their fitness compared to the ones who flew a little bit further away from home.
See, again, the liberal birds are the ones that are right.
Well, there are charts in here as well. This isn't just a crazy idea talking about birds. I've got data from Denmark, and you can look at the marital radius. Denmark's great because you have this almost perfect population registry. You can look at every woman who was born, I think it was the year 1954, and who had a full reproductive career. And they looked at the radius of where she was born and where her husband was born, and then they plotted the fertility. And you could see that at an intermediate distance, there's a sort of an optimal level where they're having the greatest number of children, and the ones who went much further had fewer, just like the ones who stayed closer to home had fewer. I should emphasize this is only one of the 3 personality clusters. So many other issues involved. This is an important one. I think one that's been completely overlooked. This is a very novel part of our political nature.
Right. So let me come back to the gray tits and relate it back to that. So do we pick our mates based on if they are similar to us genetically in this way? And if we do, over an enormously long period of time, do we risk being 2 different species?
So the overall question is yes. Overall, when you look at a huge population, human beings, in addition to other animals, are picking mates who are more closely related to them than somebody chosen at random. And when I say related, I mean in terms of almost anything you measure, whether it's biometric measurements, like you can measure their ears and their necks, education and so on, and you get these small correlations, or a basic personality trait like extroversion has a very small correlation. But there are 2 really important things here. One is if you separate people into liberals and conservatives, you get different tendencies. So we know from all this online dating data, information, that liberals are more likely to prefer a partner who may be of a different race or different body type, and conservatives are more likely to prefer somebody on these online sites who's in their own ethnic group, which isn't really a huge surprise, perhaps. What was...
That's right, because they're racist. No, I'm kidding. And black people can choose black women, black guys. There's no... So I'm kidding, there's no judgment, yes.
Okay. But what was a huge surprise to me is, in doing all this research, of all the things that spouses do share in common, the one trait that they're most likely to share is actually their political orientation. And this was much higher correlation than all the other ones that were really small. So this is absolutely fascinating, and I think this is part of the reason why people, especially in America right now, are sorting themselves out into increasingly ideologically coherent counties. And a number of American counties where there have been landslide presidential elections by 20 points or more has doubled in the last generation or more. So our political nature explains what's driving this process.
That's interesting. So we might be a more polarized country because we're choosing to mate with people that are of similar political persuasion as we are.
That's true. That's, I think, one of the long-term trends. There's also the economic crisis that had a polarizing effect that we noticed.
How so?
Well, after the 2008 crisis, when we saw the fallout, our political spectrum expanded. So we saw the Occupy movement to the far left of the spectrum, as well as the Tea Party movement on the far right. And that's normal. In fact, you can look at countries around the world, and the more economic pressure they're under, the lower the GDP per capita of the country, the wider political spectrums they have. And as countries get richer, like in Brazil, as a sixth of the population went into the middle class in the last decade, you see a much greater political moderation in the country, and a totally different kind of protest, where people are demanding more education, more for their taxes, where they have less faith in government officials. Whereas people who are fearing they're going to leave the middle class are willing to entertain the idea of a much stronger political authority, to look for help beyond themselves as an individual. But this doesn't help us know whether they'll choose someone on the left or the right. This really comes down mostly to their personality.
Okay, and is this also related to religion? Do people make religious choices in the same way?
Absolutely. So religion and religiosity, this is one of the 3 parts of the tribalism cluster that I mentioned. And also, I want to mention something important here, because I think it's a fact that's been overlooked by a lot of the discussion on religion by evolutionists. There's this kind of new atheist group, and they basically say that religion is something that we're selected for as a total accident. In other words, there's nothing about religion itself that is helpful in an evolutionary sense. It's just our ancestors, the ones who were more likely to believe in stories or understand make up stories about what causes what, that this was beneficial, and then you have religions. What I show in the book is research, a huge sample, very, very solid research showing that this doesn't seem to be true. Actually, anywhere around the world where people have higher beliefs in heaven, or maybe lower beliefs in abortion, more pro-life beliefs, and of course that's a complicated issue that I go into some depth in describing. But in any case, these do have an effect on fitness. People are having higher lifetime fertility by having certain religious beliefs, which is very interesting. And in fact, evolution is continuing right now, and I think this is one of the areas where we're seeing demographic changes, because as countries get wealthier, you have this demographic transition, which means even though resources are more abundant, there's this paradoxical trend that women stop having as many children. But in spite of this, people who are more religious are having more children than people who aren't, even in these richer countries, even when you control for socioeconomic group.
Right. And look, religion made a lot of sense before. We couldn't figure out what the hell was going on. And religion was basically our best guess at what was happening. We're like, I don't know, it looks like God is poking holes in the sky. That's why, and then we figured out, oh no, this turns out they're stars. But it was an attempt to explain the world. So if you were religious, at least back then, you were at least trying to explain the world, as opposed to just walking around aimlessly, right? And the other reason why religion might be good for your health, whether it's right or wrong, is it gives you hope, right? If there's a God who's going to take care of me, who believes in me, I have faith in him, and so I will persevere because I know good things are ahead because of my faith, right?
Sure. It's good to be a little bit optimistic, even more optimistic than we probably should be. There's so many ways you can look at religion. It's such a fascinating and complex phenomenon, and the way I look at it in the book is a bit reduced. I'm just interested in how does religiosity vary in a population, and how is that affecting people's, one, their political behavior, and number two, are there any evolutionarily important differences between people who believe more or believe less? And the answer in both cases is definitely yes, and it's very interesting to think about religion in that way.
Right. So now let's get to how we can use this knowledge, right? Because number one, we were just talking about hope. I think a rational person listening to this conversation says, oh boy, I'm a little worried that things are hopeless, because if you're evolutionarily disposed to be in one direction or another, how in the world am I ever going to convince you? And how are you going to make rational decisions as opposed to ones driven by something that was, that you were born into both genetically and environmentally?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm actually optimistic because we do have a problem, but I look at the problem differently. I think the problem is, as people get more and more educated, we have huge demographic changes since the 60s. More groups in society are getting greater education, but the effect this is having is that more education and more interest in politics are having a polarizing effect. So liberals are coming out more liberal, and conservatives are coming out often more conservative with more years of schooling, because we get better at absorbing knowledge about political events. We kind of interpret it in these more coherent ideologies and so forth, but people as a whole really haven't had a chance to take a step back and contemplate the origin of our political orientations, except for the group of people who've been working on this. And I think there's a high degree of agreement among this group, and people have also expressed a sense of growing moderation. And there's a new book that came out just after Our Political Nature called Predisposed, which is a complementary and I think an excellent work as well. And the authors said, they made 2 points that I think are worth repeating. One is that it is possible to learn another political orientation, almost like a second language, and to practice seeing the world in a different way. I completely agree with that. And probably the more important point is they looked at a similar phenomenon, which is sexual orientation.
Yeah.
And
Interesting.
and they had a chart.
Are we back to the great tits or no? Okay, all right, go ahead.
So they had a chart in their book, and they showed, what proportion of society thinks that homosexuality is a choice versus genetic. And as more and more people thought it's genetic, you see the same exact line on the chart showing people who are more tolerant of people of different sexual orientations. So there's obviously a relationship. And I think the same thing would happen with political orientation. If we saw it as a predisposition, not that people are hardwired, but we have these different personality traits, and that's partly we're born with them. And people who don't agree with us aren't evil. It's not just if we only gave them better information, and we're living in this kind of false hope and expectation that if we just do our job better as a political party, we'll get those other people to understand the issue, and then we'll all agree. And it leads people into a lot of wasted effort. And it is important to communicate ideas, but...
Well, I'm trying to connect the two things you said. So on the one hand, people are getting more tolerant of gays, so that indicates that we are, at least all of us to some degree, are open to changing our positions on something, right? So that's very hopeful, right? But on the other hand, we can't just convince them with logic. Like if I give them facts, and we've showed the studies here on the show as well, let alone what's in your book, that even if both liberals and conservatives, even if they get facts that are counter to their ideology, we'll just twist them and then reinforce their ideology, even though that's not what the facts said at all. It said the opposite. So that's kind of discouraging. But how do you square those two things? So like on the one hand, that's the case. On the other hand, sometimes we all begin to agree that, for example, of being tolerant of homosexuality.
When you look at a question like homosexuality or a number of other ones, there are a few cases in public opinion where over the decades you do see massive sea rise changes. I have to emphasize that's rare, that's not common when it happens. And another textbook issue is people who agree with a woman's working outside of the home even if her husband can support her. Or interracial marriage is another issue. We've had massive changes. And most issues, actually, we don't see these changes. And when they do occur, I think there are important issues to look at. And the book does look at one of these, especially the one about gender inequality, why that changes over human history. There's a whole lot going on. But even when we do see these changes, it's important to mention that the kind of stratification between conservatives, moderates, and liberals stays the same. So I think in the future, even if you have most people approving of gay marriage, you'll still have people who are relatively more liberal or conservative, or even if people say they're more open in terms of inter-ethnic kind of issues, when you measure them physiologically and fear responses and so on, you still find so some of it's like a social desirability bias, or what people feel comfortable saying. There's also the political correctness. So you do have changes, but we're not quite as flexible, I think.
No, I understand. So we're not flexible on most things, but every once in a while there's an outlier issue where we are flexible. Mm-hmm. And let's just keep it real on that, right? So the liberals were open-minded to begin with. I mean, that's in their nature, right? And conservatives were less open-minded, and then they become more open-minded to, for example, interracial marriage. Mm-hmm. So when people were opposed to interracial marriage, conservatives were opposed to it, right? Mm-hmm. Now, they like to deny that now, but it doesn't make any sense. It's a historical fact, right? Mm-hmm. Now, I know because they'll take the historical fact and flip it on its head, and liberals do it too. But in this case, but honestly, in all the things that you mentioned, whether it's gay rights, it's civil rights, it's women working in the workplace, etc., mm-hmm. the liberals win. And one of my theories is that the arc of history does bend towards not just justice, but towards progressivism. Like every major battle that this ideological battle we've had in this country, progressives have won, right? Now, in the short term, conservatives kick our ass all the time, right? Mm-hmm. Politically, etc., right? But we've gotten more and more rights for these different groups. First it was property owners, then became all white males, then women, then African Americans, then gays, etc., etc. So how do we eventually, like, what was the magic trick that allowed progressives to win on all of those major issues? How did they convince conservatives to be more open-minded if it's against their nature?
Well, I'd like to reframe this analysis a little bit.
All right, God bless.
What I see is more a win for liberalism and liberal democracy. And that's a little bit different than saying that the left has won against the right. I think individualism is certainly winning with our new technologies, but that's a little bit different than saying that the left is winning. Our whole lifestyles are becoming more individualistic, and the iPhone, iPad, this. So there's certainly economic and technological reasons why this is occurring that I think explain it every bit as much as if it were like a battle of sheer ideological willpower. I have the same opinion when it comes to gender inequality, since I think most people don't understand what really causes gender inequality. They look at it as only an issue of activism. And I don't want to say that activism isn't important, because surely activism for whatever issue and whatever side does have an impact. But there are also much deeper forces that explain why these things are changing over human history. And I do get into the gender issue in the book and a couple other ones, but
But the bottom line is, people who are more closed-minded in every one of those instances became more open-minded, at least on those issues, although the core of their character might have remained the same, right? So do you have a sense of what it was that made a difference for them on those issues that they were willing to say, let me try that mushroom?
Well, I don't know, how much change there really is. It's very hard to tell. I think there was a real moment in our country recently with the Trayvon Martin incident, where you could really see how divided America is over a pretty fundamental political issue, which has to do with race and inter-ethnic relations. So obviously America has made a tremendous amount of progress, but if you just look at the coverage and the way the media portrayed this incident and people's opinions,
we're still polarized on that issue.
We're very polarized.
Right. All right. One last thing. Bragging rights between liberals and conservatives on this one issue. Who is more rational? Because if you listen to a conservative, these soft-headed liberals, right? They don't understand the real world, and so the conservatives are the rational ones. The liberals say, these guys who are anti-science and these knuckleheads and backwards, etc. No, liberals are the ones that are rational. So who's right?
Well, let's take an issue like Iran. You have a new president, Rouhani, and he comes in with a diplomatic charm offensive, and it divides the American political spectrum. People on the left, like President Obama, who from the very beginning of his first term was reaching out and writing a Nowruz, a New Year's greeting card. He had the assumption that the Iranian government, the regime, is going to be cooperative if only the U.S. changed its stance. And some people would argue that that's ignoring a lot of history and even other democratic presidents and so on. And the conservatives are saying, well, I don't believe that for a second. They're just blowing smoke in our eyes. And I think the answer in this particular case, and this is only one case of many political dilemmas, depends on what happens in the future. And I don't know what will happen, but obviously one side will be more right or more wrong, and really, theoretically, it could go either way.
So, look, when you look at results-based, who was more rational, yes, you're right. In some cases, like the Iraq War, sorry, we were right, the conservatives were wrong, okay? It's obvious, and now everybody pretends that they knew it all along, right?
Right.
So, and some things are clear like that, although many things are not. But that's not what I'm asking. Like, in terms of structure of, that we get, structure of the brain, our nature, et cetera, left spectrum versus right side of the spectrum politically, is there a conclusion that could be had? And if there isn't, that's totally fine. But I'm just curious, which side leans towards the rational?
There are laboratory experiments that psychologists put subjects in where there really is a right or wrong answer, and they have to do with people's attention. Whether you're more likely to identify a pattern being broken or not being broken. Or there was a recent experiment looking at people's inside of their brains as they're gambling. And in both of those cases, there wasn't a clear rational winner. But for example, when you looked in their brains, different parts of the liberal brain were activating when there was risk compared with a different region of the conservative brain on average. And these are all just statistical trends. It's not really a dichotomy as much as we speak about it in that way. So in both of the experiments I'm thinking of, there wasn't a clear winner. And I think that makes sense, because if over a long amount of time one side was always right, then obviously there'd be an imbalance in this distribution of our personalities. You wouldn't find a bell-shaped curve in most populations when you're looking at left-right political orientation.
Yeah, and of course, that spectrum is totally different in different countries, right? So like the US is much more right-wing than, for example, Finland. And so, but that's a whole different topic, and it's interesting. Are you going to disagree?
No. Well, so actually, most countries do have a bell-shaped curve, but this entire curve does shift to the left or the right, and it depends on many different things. One of the interesting factors is the homeland of a population's ancestors seems to influence the average personality traits, political personality traits in that population. So this is one of the mysteries that our political nature unravels.
So as to why Europe would be more liberal, for example, and
why Northern Europe seems to be a more liberal region than, say, the Middle East.
Yeah, and then you get into other issues that are super interesting too. Like in Malcolm Gladwell's book, he talks about how in France there's more of a leisurely art culture because of the nature of their farming. You know, how many hours they had to farm in a day, which wasn't very much. A very fruitful land, so that they gave more time for leisure, and that's why the culture developed in the way that it did. And obviously for political things, you would have similar issues at play. And finally, look, my last point is, on the Iranian example that you gave, to me, I always think like, well, of course you should be open to them changing, and of course you shouldn't necessarily expect it naively, right? So I'm always confused as to why the two sides can't see each other. Like, well, obviously, as you said, the conservatives could be right, and the liberals could be right. It depends on the situation, right? And so I hope, and I'm not sure that I got it clear enough, says I hope that people are open enough to be able to still take facts into consideration. And unfortunately, the overall sense I'm getting is a little bit, but not that much. Like that they should be more, they should be, that's a value judgment, but I wish they were more open to facts than apparently our nature allows for. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I'm with you there, and I think that the more that people are looking at this new research that's arising, that they'll be able to do that more successfully, that we'll be better off as a country, we'll be able to appreciate people who are different, how ideological diversity can be a positive, and not just a zero-sum horse race where we're always trying to see who's ahead and who's behind.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And if I was president, somebody came to me and said, "Oh no, it's okay, you're a liberal, so let's just trust Iran, everything will be fine," I'd be like, "Are you crazy?" Like, no, I mean, we shouldn't pull a Cheney and say we don't talk to evil, and we shouldn't say, "Yeah, let's just put roses in our guns, everything will be fine." Right? There is a fair middle ground. In my experience, it's usually the rational middle ground. But we'll see if, as a society, we can get there. But this book helps us to understand it better. It's called Our Political Nature, the Evolutionary Origins of What Divides Us. Avi Tuschman, thanks so much for coming in. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Jake.